Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're getting into something I think really hits home for a lot of us. It's a philosophical problem, sure, but it plays out in our lives every single day. It's this deep conflict, isn't it, between this idea that morally everyone should count equally and, well, the fact that we pour so much into our own families, our friends.
That's exactly it. It's the problem of partiality. And it's a tough nut to crack for ethical theories. We have this strong commitment, this ideal of impartiality. You know the phrase, count for one, nobody for more than one.
Right, fairness, equality. Everyone gets the same moral consideration.
That's the ideal. But then, like you said, there's real life. You're a parent, you're a child, a friend, and we feel this powerful pull, maybe even a duty, to put extra resources, extra effort into their well-being.
Yeah, think about, say, paying for your kids' piano lessons, or maybe expensive tutoring.
Exactly. It feels right, even necessary. But then you step back and think that same money, viewed impartially, could potentially save a life or feed a family somewhere else for months.
So how is it okay? How do we justify spending so much on one person we love when the needs elsewhere are so vast? That's the paradox.
That is precisely the paradox. And our mission today is to, well, take a deep dive into how this specific tension really unfolded and was debated in 18th century British moral philosophy. They were trying to figure out the scope, the limits of what they called reasonable partiality.
Reasonable partiality, I like that term. So it wasn't just anything goes for your loved ones.
No, not at all. They were trying to find a principled way to balance these commitments, and we're going to look at two main strategies they developed.
Okay, what were they?
So first, you had thinkers who essentially rejected the premise. They argued maybe morality doesn't have to be strictly impartial. Maybe it's rooted in our feelings, our sentiments, our natural partiality. That's the partialist or sentimentalist approach.
Interesting. Challenging the core assumption.
Yeah.
And the second?
The second strategy tried to work within the impartial framework. They argued you can justify some degree of preference, some partiality, but only if it ultimately serves an impartial goal, like overall happiness or utility. That's the impartialist route.
Got it. So one says partiality is fundamental. The other says it needs justification from an impartial standpoint. And this isn't just abstract stuff, right? You mentioned practical ethics.
Absolutely. They were deeply concerned with real-world issues. How do you handle disagreements? How do you deal with factions, with conflicting loyalties in society? It was about the art of living, not just theorizing.
Okay, so where do we start? Who kicked off this whole debate in the 18th century?
Well, you really have to begin with John Locke. Even though he's slightly earlier, his ideas cast a long shadow. He set the stage with two core ideas that almost all the British moralists picked up on.
Which were?
First, the goal of morality is practical. It's about coordinating people's different interests to achieve basically general happiness, social harmony.
Makes sense. Morality as a tool for a functioning society.
Right. And second, we figure out the content of morality by studying human nature. We look at ourselves as beings who feel, who reason, who are naturally sociable. Our duties come from what we are.
A science human nature defined moral rules.
Okay, but this is crucial. Locke introduced a real wobble, a tension. He talked about moral ideas like justice, or even something like sacrilege as mixed modes.
Mixed modes, what does that mean?
It means they're complex ideas that we put together in our minds. They aren't simple perceptions of the world. They're sort of constructed, artificial in a way, contingent on human thought.
Uh-oh. If justice is just something we've cobbled together, where does its authority come from? Why must we follow it? That sounds like it could lead to relativism or something.
Exactly. That's the crisis it created. If these core moral concepts are arbitrary human constructs, how can they be binding laws? Locke himself kind of struggled with this. His solution was to ground morality's force in God's will.
The divine command route.
Right. And enforced by sanctions. Civil punishments, social disapproval, and critically divine punishment. The fear of hell, basically. So the moral law is real, but its binding power comes from outside, from God's decree, not necessarily from its inherent reasonableness or naturalness.
This feels a bit unstable, philosophically.
Yeah.
Relying on sanctions.
It did to many who followed him. This reliance on divine will, potentially arbitrary will, and external punishments bothered people, which leads us to thinkers like Catherine Trotter Cockburn. She really pushed back against that interpretation of Locke.
How so?
Cockburn wanted to ground morality more firmly. She argued that the content of morality, what makes something right or wrong, isn't based on God's arbitrary whim. It flows directly from our fixed human nature.
Okay, so back to the science of human nature idea.
Yes. She famously said, God, having made man such a creature as he is, it is impossible that good and evil should change their respect to him. Morality is about acting in a way that's fitting to our nature as sociable beings, promoting the flourishing of the whole system.
So the what of morality is natural, grounded in us. But what about the why? Why do people actually do it? Did she still need the sanctions?
She did, interestingly. She thought the content was natural and discoverable by reason, but she agreed with Locke on motivation. For the generality of mankind, as she put it, you still needed those external motivations, especially the fear of divine punishment. Reason might show the way, but fear keeps most people on the path.
Still feels like a disconnect between the rule and the reason for following it.
It does. And this brings us right to Shaftesbury. He was Locke's student, but he took a radically different turn, especially on motivation. Shaftesbury just threw out the need for external sanctions altogether.
Really? No rewards, no punishments?
He thought they were actually bad for morality. True virtue, for Shaftesbury, had to be disinterested, done for its own sake, not for hope of heaven or fear of hell.
So where does the motivation come from then, if not fear or reward?
From love, specifically universal love. He used this analogy of appreciating beauty.
How does that work?
Think about how you appreciate a beautiful piece of art. You see the specific object, but its real beauty, for Shaftesbury, comes from how it reflects a deeper universal harmony, a kind of cosmic order or beauty. Virtue is similar. It's about loving humanity, loving the system, based on appreciating its inherent harmony and goodness.
Universal love. That
Right.
sounds very grand, but does it connect back to, loving your actual friend or your child?
And that's exactly where Shaftesbury runs into what we can call the two standpoints problem. This grand vision of universal love actually splits the moral self in two.
How so?
Okay, standpoint one is the human particular viewpoint. You love your friend as your friend, their specific personality, their history with you, their flaws and strengths. And that love demands partiality. It requires you to do things for them you wouldn't do for a stranger. It's demanding specific bias.
Right, that feels like real friendship.
Yeah.
Well, it's standpoint two.
Standpoint two is the universal, almost cosmic viewpoint. From here, you love humanity, or even the entire universe, as components of this perfect, harmonious system Shaftesbury envisions. This demands detachment, impartiality, a concern for the conservation of the whole system above any individual part. It's more like a Stoic perspective.
I can see the clash immediately.
Right.
How do you hold both? Especially when things go wrong.
Exactly. Think about losing a loved one. From standpoint one, the standpoint of particular love, it's devastating. Grief is appropriate, maybe even required. You'd do anything to prevent it. But from standpoint two, the Stoic universal view, that individual loss is just a small adjustment within the larger perfect system, necessary for the overall balance. Grief might even be seen as irrational resistance to the natural harmonious order. You should aim for acceptance, resignation.
That sounds incredibly cold. How can you be a loving friend or parent from that second standpoint?
You can't, really, not in the way we normally understand it. Shaftesbury leaves the agent torn. How do you reconcile the sociable virtue of friendship, which requires intense partiality, with the Stoic virtue of resignation to the greater good, which demands impartiality and detachment? He defines virtue as this universal love, but doesn't really show us how to live it without sacrificing our specific human connections. This is where the partiality problem really comes into sharp focus.
Okay, so Shaftesbury identifies this deep split, this tension between loving the particular and loving the universal. Who picks up this thread?
Francis Hutcheson is the key figure here. He really took Shaftesbury's ideas about inherent virtue and tried to systematize them. He's famous for the concept of the moral sense.
Moral sense. What was that exactly? Like another sense, taste or touch?
Pretty much, yeah. He argued we have this innate faculty, like our sense of beauty, that directly perceives moral goodness or badness in actions or characters. It's immediate, not based on reasoning or calculation initially.
And what does this moral sense approve of? What feels good to it?
Benevolence. Disinterested love or goodwill towards others. For Hutcheson, actions are only truly virtuous if they spring from this benevolent motive. That's the true spring of virtue, as he put it.
Okay, so morality is rooted in this natural feeling of goodwill, protected by a special sense. But does this solve Shaftesbury's problem? Does benevolence naturally apply universally?
Well, that's where Hutcheson runs into the same practical difficulty. He acknowledges that while the moral sense approves of universal benevolence, our actual feeling of benevolence is, well, much weaker when it comes to distant strangers or humanity in general.
It's strongest close to home.
Exactly. It's strongest for what he calls the little department, our family, our dependents, our neighbors, the people we actually interact with. So you have this gap again. The moral standard is universal benevolence, but our natural capacity for feeling it is intensely local and partial.
Right. The feeling doesn't scale well. So if our natural motivation is mostly local, how did Hutcheson think we could possibly live up to the demands of universal benevolence that the moral sense supposedly requires?
His solution was to bring in piety.
Piety, like religious devotion.
Yes, specifically a constant effort to imitate God. Since God is perfectly good and universally benevolent, by striving to be like God, humans could strengthen their own benevolence and extend its reach beyond just their immediate circle. Piety becomes the motivational booster shot for universal concern.
I feel like we're heading back towards that earlier tension. If the moral sense is natural, based on human feeling, isn't trying to imitate a perfect, perhaps detached, divine being going to mess with those natural feelings?
That's the risk, absolutely. You're asking people to model themselves on something potentially quite unhuman in its perfect impartiality. Does imitating divine detachment undermine the very tender natural affections that Hutcheson himself says are the foundation of our strongest benevolence in the little department?
It seems like it could. You might become so focused on the abstract general good or imitating God that you neglect the concrete needs of the person right in front of you.
Hutcheson saw this danger himself. He actually warned against letting airy views of more heroic, extensive offices, trying to save the world, weaken those crucial close bonds. He knew there was a risk of becoming morally cold or detached by aiming too high.
So why bring piety in so centrally if it's so risky? Why not just say, do the best you can with your natural local benevolence?
I think it goes back to that lingering Lockean worry about motivation, about self-interest. Hutcheson recognized that self-love is also a powerful natural motive. If local benevolence is often too weak on its own to overcome selfishness, especially when acting for the greater good requires personal sacrifice, you need something stronger.
In piety, the focus on divine perfection provides that extra push.
That seems to be the idea. It acts as this external, transcendent goal that can hopefully pull us beyond our inherent limitations and partiality. But ultimately, Hutcheson doesn't fully resolve it. He leaves us with this tension. The moral ideal is universal benevolence, our nature pushes us towards local affection, and the proposed bridge, piety, threatens to undermine the very foundation it's trying to build upon. It's Shaftesbury's dilemma again, just codified more systematically. Is general benevolence something humans should actually try to embody, or is it a divine trait we can only imperfectly admire?
Okay, so the path, starting from inherent sentiment, from Shaftesbury and Hutcheson, seems to get tangled up in this conflict between local feelings and universal ideals, even needing this potentially problematic piety fix. What about the other approach, the impartialists?
Right. They took a different tack entirely. Instead of starting with partial sentiments, they started with an impartial standard and tried to explain how we could come to follow it and how partiality might fit within it. A key, though sometimes overlooked figure here is John Gay.
John Gay. What was his contribution?
Gay was really trying to bring clarity to Locke's ethics, building on that practical, coordinating aim of morality. He proposed a single, clear criterion for virtue: universal happiness. Does the action tend to promote the happiness of everyone? That's the test.
Okay, that sounds like early utilitarianism. Promote the greatest happiness. But again, the motivation question pops up, doesn't it? Why should I, a self-interested person, care about universal happiness?
Gay's answer was ingenious and really important for later thinkers. He proposed psychological association.
Association, like associating ideas.
Exactly. He argued that all our actions are ultimately aimed at our own pleasure or avoiding pain. Initially, we might act virtuously just because we associate it with rewards, maybe divine rewards, or social approval, or avoiding punishment. It starts as calculated self-interest.
Okay, like Cockburn's point about sanctions.
Yes, but Gay adds a crucial step. Through repetition, we start to associate the pleasure that results from the general happiness, which virtuous actions tend to produce, directly with the action itself. The action starts to feel good on its own, not just because of the external reward.
So the motivation becomes internalized. We learn to find pleasure in promoting the general good.
Precisely. Virtue becomes an acquired principle of action. It starts extrinsic, based on sanctions, but through association, it becomes intrinsic. We enjoy acting virtuously because we've associated it with pleasant outcomes, general happiness.
That's quite clever. How does it handle partiality, then? Is it okay to favor your family?
For Gay, partiality is permissible only if it serves the overall goal of universal happiness. So yes, caring for your own family is generally good for society. It prevents them becoming a burden, it fosters stability. Therefore, it's justified from that impartial utilitarian perspective. It makes the partiality problem much simpler, in a way. Impartiality is the rule, explained by utility, and we're motivated towards it through learned association, essentially making it a sophisticated form of self-interest.
Okay, that sets things up nicely for David Hume, who everyone knows is a giant in this area. Did he follow Gay's associationist path?
He did use association, but in a distinct way. Hume also starts with a mechanism that connects us emotionally to others. Sympathy.
Sympathy. We feel what others feel.
Roughly, yes. It's an associative mechanism that lets us enter into the feelings of others. But Hume immediately sees the problem Gay perhaps downplayed. Sympathy on its own is incredibly partial.
Right. We sympathize much more strongly with people close to us, or situations we can easily imagine. A friend's minor problem can affect us more than a distant famine.
Exactly. Sympathy is variable, it's local, it depends on proximity and resemblance. It can't be the direct foundation for stable, impartial moral judgment. So, Hume argues, we need a way to correct our raw, variable, sympathetic responses.
And how do we do that? How do we get from biased sympathy to impartial judgment?
Through adopting what Hume calls the common point of view, CPV. This isn't about feeling universal benevolence, it's about adopting a shared, stable perspective for making judgments. We develop this perspective through social interaction, conversation, and especially through using moral language.
How does language help?
Think about it. When we talk about actions or characters, we don't usually just say, I like that, or that made me feel good. We use general terms. That was generous, that was cruel, that was just. These words carry a built-in expectation of agreement.
They imply a standard that anyone looking from the right perspective should accept.
Precisely. The CPV uses language that reflects the general interests of the community. We learn to praise traits and actions that are typically useful or agreeable to self or others, with usefulness generally taking priority because it serves the community's stability and happiness. We correct our fluctuating personal feelings by appealing to this shared, steady viewpoint reflected in our language.
Okay, so we have this social mechanism, the CPV, that pushes us towards impartial standards. But what makes an individual actually want to adopt this view, especially when their personal feelings, their sympathy, might be pulling them in a different, more partial direction?
Hume identifies two key cultivated traits, aspects of character that foster this moral responsiveness. The first is delicacy of taste.
Delicacy, like an art appreciation.
Yes, exactly like that, but extended to morality and conduct. It's a refined sensitivity to beauty and ugliness, both in external things and in human character. For Hume, cultivating this taste helps to smooth out our violent, selfish passions. It transforms them into calmer, more measured, more objective feelings. A person with delicacy is less likely to be swept away by raw emotion and better able to adopt the stable CPV.
So refinement breeds objectivity. What's the second trait?
The second is what he calls a due sense of pride. This isn't vanity or arrogance, it's a proper awareness of one's own merit and character, combined with a strong desire to be the kind of person who deserves praise from others, especially from those whose judgment we respect, those who also possess delicacy.
So pride makes us care about the community's judgment.
Yes, it internalizes the praise and blame associated with the CPV. We want to see ourselves and be seen by others as possessing the approved qualities justice, benevolence, industriousness. Pride motivates us to regulate our own behavior to align with those shared, impartial standards because our self-worth becomes tied to meeting them.
That seems like a very elegant system. Impartiality arises from social interaction, language, and cultivated personal traits like taste and pride. But does it have a downside? Does this reliance on refinement create any new problems?
It absolutely does. And Hume saw this potential problem, which we can call the dilemma of variability, or maybe the problem of moral snobbery.
Snobbery, how?
Well, think about what happens if you cultivate delicacy of taste to a very high degree. You become very sensitive to refinement, to proportion, to agreeableness. What happens when you encounter people who lack that refinement? People Hume might have called the coarse or the vulgar.
You might find them unpleasant, disagreeable.
Exactly. Hume worried that the highly refined person might view those outside their cultivated social circle with disgust and uneasiness. The very mechanism designed to create impartiality participation in polite society and the cultivation of taste could paradoxically breed a new kind of partiality, a contempt for those deemed unrefined.
Wow. So the solution creates its own form of division. An aristocracy of taste, almost.
It's a serious risk. If the path to impartial morality alienates you from or makes you feel contempt for large segments of the very community whose general interests you're supposed to be considering, then the impartialist project might be self-defeating. It might just swap natural biases for intellectual or aesthetic ones, undermining the very social cohesion it aims to build.
Okay, so Hume's impartialist system, while elegant, potentially leads to this kind of refined disdain or factionalism. That seems like a strong reason to reconsider the other path, the one that starts with our natural sentiments.
Absolutely, and this brings us to Joseph Butler, who was actually a contemporary of Hutcheson, but offers a different flavor of partialism. Butler fundamentally disagreed with the idea that our passions are problems to be overcome or merely tools for some external goal like utility.
What was his view then?
For Butler, our passions, our natural affections, actually provide the ends or goals of morality. Things like benevolence, self-love, even resentment in its proper place. These are part of our God-given nature, and they direct us towards what's good. And crucially, our primary duties lie within our little department, our immediate sphere of influence, neighbors, family, those we can directly affect.
So morality starts local, with our natural feelings directing us to care for those around us.
Yeah.
But passions can conflict, right? Self-love can clash with benevolence. How did Butler handle that? Does one automatically trump the other?
No, that's where conscience comes in for Butler. Conscience isn't about discovering abstract rules or aiming for universal happiness. It acts like an internal judge or magistrate.
A magistrate, how so?
Its job is to oversee the different passions and principles within us, self-love, benevolence, particular affections, and ensure they operate in the right proportion. It has natural authority. Conscience tells us when a particular passion, say anger, has become excessive and is interfering with a more important principle, like goodwill or justice. It's about internal balance and hierarchy, not maximizing utility.
So morality is about listening to this internal guide, conscience, to keep our natural, often partial affections in check and in proper balance.
That's the core idea. We follow our nature, guided by conscience's authority. But Butler was also acutely aware of a major human failing that messes this up.
What's that?
Self-deception. Our tendency to fool ourselves, to rationalize our actions, especially when self-interest is involved. We might tell ourselves our excessive ambition is really for the good of our family, or our harsh judgment is righteous anger. We willfully close the eyes of the mind, as he put it. And closely related is hypocrisy.
Right. We convince ourselves our selfish motives are actually virtuous. How did Butler suggest we combat this? How do we ensure conscience isn't being fooled by our own rationalizations?
His recommendation: piety. Specifically, resignation to the divine will. By contemplating God's perfection and authority, by trying to align our will with His, we can supposedly gain a more objective perspective, cut through our self-deceit, and allow conscience to function properly.
Wait a minute, piety again. Didn't we see this with Hutcheson? And didn't it risk undermining the very local affections they were trying to champion?
We did, and it absolutely carries the same risk here. It's the recurring tension. Butler grounds morality firmly in our particular human nature and duties within the little department. But to safeguard this system against the human weakness of self-deception, he brings back this appeal to divine will, to a kind of stoic resignation.
And that risks pulling our focus away from the specific, messy human relationships that he said were primary. Directing our deepest affections towards a perfect, abstract God could potentially weaken our commitment to imperfect, real people.
Precisely. It reintroduces that Shaftesbury fracture. Butler wants to affirm the moral authority of our natural partial affections guided by conscience, but his cure for self-deception piety threatens to replace those affections with a detached, universal focus, bringing back the very problem he sought to avoid. It's a deep instability in the system.
This seems like a persistent problem for the sentimentalists.
Yeah.
Which leads us finally to Adam Smith. How did he navigate this? Did he also rely on piety?
Smith built heavily on Butler's foundation, especially the emphasis on sentiment and the immediate social context. But he sought a more thoroughly human mechanism for moral judgment and correction, moving away from divine imitation. For Smith, the key concept is propriety.
Propriety, meaning what exactly? Like proper manners?
More fundamental than that. It's about the fitness or appropriateness of our emotions and actions given the specific situation. Is the level of your anger appropriate to the provocation? Is the depth of your grief fitting for the loss?
Okay, fitness of response.
Yeah.
And how do we judge that fitness? Who decides what's proper?
Not an external rule like utility, and not just our own feeling. Propriety is judged by sympathy, but specifically the sympathy of the impartial spectator.
The impartial spectator. That's a famous phrase. What is it? An actual person. God.
No, it's more like an internalized viewpoint. It represents the judgment of a well-informed, unbiased observer. It's the perspective of the moral community, or what any reasonable person looking dispassionately at the situation would feel.
So when I'm feeling an emotion, say anger, I should ask myself, would a neutral observer, knowing all the facts, sympathize with the degree of my anger?
Exactly. The spectator doesn't primarily care if your anger maximizes happiness. It cares if it can enter into your feeling. If your anger seems wildly excessive compared to the cause, the impartial spectator cannot sympathize and your feeling lacks propriety. It's a test of emotional resonance and proportionality, judged from a hypothetical impartial viewpoint.
That sounds much more grounded in human interaction than piety. How did Smith view those grander Stoic or universal perspectives?
Smith was deeply skeptical of them. He famously used the Stoic justification of suicide as a critique. The Stoic might say suicide is permissible if it aligns with the rational order of the universe. Smith saw this as epistemic immodesty.
Epistemic immodesty, meaning
Meaning it's arrogant to claim you know what the grand system of nature requires or allows. We are limited human beings. We can't possibly grasp that cosmic perspective. Trying to do so, Smith thought, distracts us from our real manageable duties in the little department, the sphere we can understand and affect.
So he actively defends our natural limitations and partiality.
He does, very powerfully. He argues that it's actually wise that nature made us care most about those we can directly interact with. He wrote that we should be but little interested in the fortune of those whom we can neither serve nor hurt. Seems wisely ordered by nature, and if it were possible to alter in this respect the original constitution of our frame, we could yet gain nothing by the change.
Wow, that's a direct challenge to the impartialist ideal. He's saying our limited focus is not a flaw to be overcome, but a feature.
Absolutely. For Smith, our sentiments, corrected by the impartial spectator, are the only reliable guide we have. Trying to impose an external abstract standard, like pure utility or stoic resignation, is a mistake. It leads either to a cold, detached indifference or paralyzing anxiety about things we can't control, or intellectual arrogance, all of which damage the actual human relationships that give life its moral substance. The impartial spectator helps correct perversions of sentiment, like excessive selfishness, but it doesn't replace sentiment with a universal calculus.
Okay, let's try to pull these threads together. We've seen these two major strategies develop in response to Locke's initial problem. If we compare Hume and Smith, the big figures at the end of this arc, how do their ultimate pictures differ on handling partiality?
Well, Hume, representing the sophisticated impartialist view, sees morality fundamentally as a system for social coordination, maximizing overall utility or happiness. Partiality, like caring for family, is acceptable because it generally contributes to that overall good. It's instrumentally justified. And, crucially for Hume, human nature is seen as quite malleable through education, association, cultivating delicacy. We can be shaped to better align with these impartial demands.
We learn to be impartial, or at least act in ways that serve impartiality.
Right, whereas Smith, the culmination of the partialist sentimentalist line, argues the opposite in some ways. For him, the structure of morality follows from our natural partial attachments. These sentiments are relatively fixed aspects of human nature, wisely ordered. Trying to impose an external standard like utility is an error, potentially harmful. Morality is about navigating our relationships appropriately within the little department, guided by sympathetic propriety.
So Hume wants to shape human nature to fit an impartial standard, while Smith wants the moral standard to respect human nature as it is, partiality included.
That's a good way to put it. Hume emphasizes reform and coordination. Smith emphasizes propriety and natural sentiment.
Despite these really fundamental disagreements about the source and nature of morality, you mentioned earlier they were both concerned with practical ethics, the art of life.
Very much so. This wasn't just armchair speculation for them. They were writing in a context where morality was under attack. You had satirists mocking moral ideals as mere hypocrisy, covering for self-interest, and you had philosophical skeptics questioning whether moral distinctions had any objective basis at all.
So they were trying to defend morality as a real practical force in human life.
Exactly. And a central part of that defense was tackling the motivational problem head-on. If morality often requires us to act against our immediate self-interest or to care about people beyond our immediate circle, how do you persuade someone to do that? Why bother being moral when it doesn't always seem to pay off directly?
How did their different approaches answer that?
Well, the impartialists like Hume ultimately appealed to mechanisms like association, learning to enjoy a virtue. And social forces the desire for approval, the due sense of pride that makes us responsive to the community's judgment via the CPV. The partialists, like Butler and Smith, appealed more to the inherent authority and satisfaction of our natural sentiments when properly balanced the authority of conscience, the felt rightness of propriety judged by the impartial spectator. They argued that living according to our true, sociable nature is fulfilling.
Interesting. Smith, I know, later wrote The Wealth of Nations, which is often seen as being about self-interest in the economic sphere. Did he try to separate the moral sphere from the economic or political one?
He did make a distinction, which is quite relevant here. You could say he saw ethics, governed by propriety and the impartial spectator, as primarily concerning our behavior within the little department, our face-to-face interactions. Then jurisprudence and politics dealt with the larger system-level rules needed for coordinating society, which might rely more on abstract principles of justice and perhaps utility, because sympathy doesn't work well at that scale.
So different rules for different spheres. Sentiment for personal life, perhaps more impartial rules for law and policy.
Something like that. It's an attempt to manage the tension by assigning partiality and impartiality to different domains. But as you can imagine, life rarely divides so neatly.
Yeah, it doesn't really solve the core problem, does it? It just redraws the boundaries.
Yeah.
Because those spheres constantly interact.
Precisely. Think about everyday dilemmas. You're a manager. Do you promote your hardworking friend, showing loyalty, partiality, or someone slightly more qualified you don't know as well, perhaps serving the company's abstract efficiency, impartiality? You're a citizen. Do you support a policy that benefits your local community but might disadvantage a neighboring one?
The conflict is always there. We're constantly forced to weigh the demands of the little department against broader concerns, crossing those supposed boundaries Smith might have drawn.
We are. And in those moments, we often fall back on the very intuitions and frameworks these 18th century thinkers were wrestling with. Do we try to calculate the overall good, like Hume or Gay might suggest? Or do we trust our sense of what feels proper, what resonates with our corrected sentiments, like Smith or Butler would argue? The debate they started continues within us. ### outro.
So we've journeyed from Locke's initial unease about the foundations of morality, this tension between arbitrary ideas and the need for law,
Through Shaftesbury's splitting of the self between the particular and the universal.
to Hutcheson's formalizing of a moral sense and the struggle with piety.
Then the impartialist responses Gay's associationism linking virtue to utility, and Hume's sophisticated system of sympathy corrected by the common point of view, but with that risk of refinement leading to exclusion.
And finally, the renewed partialist defense, from Butler's conscience balancing our nature to Smith's powerful argument for propriety judged by the impartial spectator, grounding morality firmly in our wisely ordered, if limited, sentiments.
It's quite a journey, covering attempts to justify partiality from within, Smith, Butler, and attempts to justify it from without, Hume, Gay.
And what feels really valuable isn't necessarily that they found the answer. Maybe there isn't one single answer, but they developed this incredibly rich toolkit for thinking about the problem.
Exactly. Concepts like delicacy, self-command, conscience, the impartial spectator. These aren't just historical curiosities, they're practical tools, ways of thinking, strategies we can use ourselves when navigating the messy reality of conflicting moral demands, trying to avoid cynicism on one hand and rigid, potentially harmful factionalism on the other. They gave us a language for this ongoing internal debate.
Which leads us to a final thought for you, our listeners. Consider this. If these brilliant thinkers dedicating immense effort to creating coherent systems couldn't definitively resolve this tension between universal duty and particular love, maybe the conflict itself is fundamental. Maybe it's not meant to be solved away.
That's a provocative idea. What if the real value of the problem of partiality isn't finding a final solution, but in the way it constantly frames our moral lives? It forces us, day after day, to ask who counts, how much, and why. What might we lose, morally, if we stopped grappling with that tension? What happens if we adopt a single, simple answer, whether it's pure utilitarianism or pure personal loyalty, and in doing so, silence one crucial voice in our complex moral nature? Does moral progress perhaps lie in the